They were born beneath a dying moon, on a night when even the wolves refused to howl. In the silent corridors of the Montclair estate, two cries echoed at once, identical, piercing, and hauntingly synchronized. The midwives whispered that such births were rare omens, and the old priest who came to bless them trembled as he gazed into their eyes. For in those twin reflections, he swore he saw something not entirely human, something ancient, something that had been waiting centuries to return. That night, the family sealed the windows, burned incense, and prayed that the prophecy of the twins of ruin and rise would never come true. But fate, as always, had other plans. The Montclair family ruled their land not through armies, but through legacy. For centuries they had controlled the trade routes across the southern coasts of France. Wine, silk, gold, and secrets flowed through their ports like blood through veins. By the late 1800s, the empire was fading. Industrialization was changing Europe, the aristocracy was cracking, and the name Montclair was becoming a whisper of the old world. Yet when the twins, Adrian and Alaric Montclair, were born, the elders believed the bloodline would live again. What no one knew was that the brothers would either resurrect their dynasty or destroy it forever. But before we continue this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. From childhood, they were inseparable, mirrors in flesh and spirit. Adrian, the elder by minutes, carried a calm intelligence, always observing, always calculating. Alaric was the opposite, impulsive, fiery, a storm wrapped in silk. The villagers often saw them walking along the cliffs, hand in hand, whispering things no one could understand. Their tutor, Father Duval, wrote in his diary that the boys sometimes finished each other's sentences, and once even spoke in a language he swore he'd never heard before. By 12, Adrian could recite financial ledgers better than the estate's steward. By 13, Alaric had already seduced the daughter of a rival noble. Their parents, Lord Etienne Montclair and Lady Geneviève, knew the twins were gifted, perhaps too gifted. But what truly disturbed them was how both boys would react during the lunar eclipses. They'd vanish into the chapel crypt and emerge hours later, pale and trembling, their eyes strangely luminescent. Rumors began to spread that the Montclair twins were cursed, that their birth had awoken something buried beneath the old chapel, that the Montclair bloodline had made a pact generations ago, a forbidden oath written in blood and bound to the moon. The family archives told of an ancestor, Lucien Montclair, who in 1624 had allegedly summoned a spirit, not of heaven, but of power. In return for generations of wealth, the Montclairs were promised 2 heirs in one womb, a mirrored soul split in flesh. But the deal, like all dark pacts, carried a cost. One twin shall build the empire, the other shall break it. By 1890, as France modernized, the Montclair estate stood like a relic of a bygone age. Stone towers shadowed by ivy, portraits staring from candlelit halls, and silence that hung thick as dust. The twins, now young men of 20, inherited a dying fortune. The vineyards were barren, the ships idle, and the servants unpaid. But Adrian, the calculating one, saw opportunity in chaos. He began studying the new industries emerging across Europe: railroads, steel, and banking. Alaric, however, turned his charm toward the nobility. He attended every gala, every masked ball, every forbidden gathering where secrets were traded like gold. Together, they became unstoppable. Adrian handled the numbers. Alaric handled the people. One mind, one ambition. Within 5 years, the Montclairs had not only restored their wealth, but surpassed it. Their name reappeared in Parisian papers, whispered in salons, envied in boardrooms. But success came at a strange cost. Wherever they went, accidents followed. Rivals lost fortunes overnight. Warehouses mysteriously burned. Competitors vanished. And each time, a blood-red moon followed the event. Their mother grew fearful. "You're becoming like him," she warned Adrian one evening, her hands trembling. "Like Lucien," Adrian smiled faintly. "Perhaps that's what it takes to survive." Alaric, eavesdropping from the corridor, smiled too, but for a different reason. The brothers began to drift. Adrian's obsession with legacy grew darker. He wanted to ensure the Montclair name would never die again. He started financing laboratories in secret, experimenting with genetics, longevity, even alchemy. Alaric, on the other hand, wanted freedom. He dreamed of escaping the family curse, of building something his own. But the bond between them was unnatural. When one bled, the other felt it. When one dreamt, the other woke in terror. One autumn night in 1897, Adrian discovered something that would change everything. Deep within the family crypt, behind the stone tomb of Lucien Montclair, he found a sealed chamber, covered in symbols that pulsed faintly in the dark. Inside was a book bound in skin, written in a language he somehow understood. The opening line read, "To preserve the dynasty, one must consume the soul of his reflection." When Alaric found Adrian studying it days later, he laughed. "You're losing your mind, brother." Adrian replied coldly, "Perhaps." But madness built empires. From that night on, things changed. Servants whispered that Adrian stopped sleeping, that strange lights flickered from his chamber. Alaric began waking up with bruises he couldn't explain, his dreams filled with blood and fire. Their connection was becoming violent. The mirror bond that once united them now began to devour them from within. The tension exploded during the Winter Ball of 1898. The Montclair estate glittered with royalty and power. Dukes, bankers, politicians, all gathered to witness the rebirth of a dynasty. But as the orchestra played and champagne flowed, Adrian stood on the balcony, staring at the blood-red moon. Alaric approached him quietly. "It's done," he said. "We've built everything they said we couldn't. Let's end this now." Adrian didn't look at him. "End it? We've only begun. You don't understand, brother. We were never meant to share the world. Only one of us can rule it." Alaric's face hardened. "You're talking nonsense." Adrian turned, his eyes cold and distant. Lucian's prophecy. The book was right. One twin must die for the dynasty to live. What happened next became legend. Witnesses later claimed the lights went out all at once. A scream echoed through the ballroom. When the lamps flickered back, Alaric was gone, vanished without a trace. Adrian stood alone on the balcony, his clothes splattered with something dark, his expression serene. He told the guests his brother had left the country, but some said that on certain nights, when the moon turns red, the reflection in Adrian's mirror still moves, even when he does not. As the new century dawned, Lord Adrian Montclair became one of the most powerful men in Europe. He built factories, funded wars, and shaped governments from the shadows. Yet those closest to him claimed he was never truly alone. They swore they'd seen a second shadow following him in the corridors, and that sometimes he'd be heard whispering to someone who wasn't there. And in the vaults beneath the Montclair estate, where the candles never die, an unfinished portrait remains of two brothers, standing side by side, smiling the same smile. But one of them has no eyes. When the century turned, the world seemed reborn. Steamships replaced sails, telegrams replaced letters, and empires traded crowns for corporations. But inside the Montclair estate, time stood still. Adrian Montclair, now lord of everything his ancestors dreamed of, ruled over his domain with an invisible fist. His factories powered the New World. His banks fed nations. His name whispered across Europe like a myth. Yet those who dared to meet his eyes swore they saw exhaustion behind his brilliance and shadows behind his smile. For 10 years, no one spoke of Alaric. Officially, he had disappeared while traveling to the east. Unofficially, the servants said his laughter still echoed in the West Wing at night. Some claimed they saw footprints in the dust, bare and wet, leading from the chapel to the mirror hall. Adrian dismissed it all as superstition, until the night of his 30th birthday. It was a grand celebration. Diplomats from Britain, ministers from Paris, and noble families from Vienna all gathered under Montclair chandeliers. The orchestra played waltzes. The air shimmered with perfume and deceit. But as midnight struck, a gust of cold wind swept through the ballroom. Candles flickered, and from somewhere unseen, a voice whispered his name. Adrian. He froze. No one else seemed to notice, but he knew that voice. It wasn't imagination. It was Alaric. Later that night, Adrian walked alone into the crypt beneath the estate, carrying a lantern. The air was thick with centuries of decay, and the stone walls seemed to breathe. At the end of the passage stood the sealed chamber, the one he had opened years ago. But now it was different. The seal was broken. Inside, the book lay open on its own. The words on the page glowed faintly in red. The blood you spill is never yours alone. Adrian stepped closer, trembling. "What do you want from me?" he whispered into the darkness. A voice, soft and echoing, replied, "What was taken must be returned." He dropped the lantern and the flame exploded across the floor, revealing something carved into the stone, the outline of two figures, bound by a single chain. From that night onward, Adrian's empire began to twist. Strange reports came from his factories, workers going missing, engines malfunctioning without reason, ships sinking under calm seas. In every tragedy, someone swore they saw a man who looked exactly like Adrian watching from afar, silent and smiling. When confronted, Adrian would lose his temper violently, shouting that there was only one Montclair left. But deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. In 1902, he moved the estate's headquarters to Paris, transforming an abandoned cathedral into his private office. The building was cold, vast, and adorned with stained glass windows that told the story of twin angels, one crowned, one fallen. Every night, Adrian would sit beneath them, poring over his ledgers, his maps, his secret correspondences. But as months passed, something began to change. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. His eyes grew darker, his reflection slower to follow his movements. His advisors noticed. One evening, his closest confidant, a man named Henri Voss, approached him cautiously. "My lord," he said, "you've built an empire larger than any monarch could dream. But you're haunted. Tell me what you see when you close your eyes." Adrian didn't answer at first. Then he looked up and said softly, "I see him. Always him, smiling, waiting. He says the dynasty isn't mine, that it was never mine to begin with." Henri's face went pale. "You mean your brother?" Adrian's voice hardened. "He was my reflection, my shadow, but I consumed him. The blood oath is fulfilled." Henri hesitated. "Then why do I still hear two voices when you speak?" From that day, Henri vanished. The newspapers called it an unfortunate disappearance. The servants called it something else, the curse claiming another life. Meanwhile, Adrian's power grew monstrous. He owned railroads across Europe, oil fields in the Middle East, and secret investments in America. Governments owed him. Kings feared him. Yet his nights were plagued by visions. He dreamt of Alaric standing before a throne made of mirrors, whispering, "You didn't kill me, brother. You carried me." He'd wake screaming, drenched in sweat, sometimes with blood on his hands, though there were no wounds. In 1905, he received a letter sealed with the Montclair crest, the same crest that had been buried with Alaric's personal effects years ago. The letter read, "You built a dynasty on my bones, but the blood you stole cannot be tamed. You may wear my face, Adrian, but the world will remember mine." No signature, no sender, only the faint scent of salt and ash. The letter drove him mad. He began to see doubles of himself everywhere, in portraits, in mirrors, even in photographs. Once, during a meeting with the German Industrial Council, he stopped mid-sentence and accused a delegate of being Alaric in disguise. They laughed, until Adrian struck the man with his cane so hard it broke. The newspapers wrote it off as eccentricity, but his partners began to withdraw. The Montclair Empire was cracking again, from within. Desperate, Adrian returned to the family estate for the first time in years. The halls were empty, the portraits covered in dust. Only one candle still burned in the chapel, the one that had never gone out since the night of their birth. Kneeling before it, Adrian whispered, "What do you want from me, Alaric?" A faint whisper echoed from the crypt. "I want my name back." The sound came closer, footsteps behind him. Adrian turned, and for the briefest moment saw himself standing there. Same face, same eyes, only colder. Then the candle went out. The next morning, the servants found Adrian unconscious on the chapel floor. Around him, the walls were scratched with words, "Two cannot rule as one." He recovered physically, but his mind fractured. His doctors called it exhaustion. His priests called it possession. But Adrian began speaking as two men, one calm and regal, the other wild and furious. Sometimes he'd sign documents as A. Montclair, other times as Alaric Montclair. By 1908, the Montclair Empire operated as if two different masters gave orders, one ordering expansion, the other sabotage. Factories built under Adrian's name would mysteriously burn down days later. Ships commissioned under one signature would sink before reaching port. Investors were terrified, and through it all, Adrian claimed that Alaric was alive, working against him from the shadows. One cold December night, Adrian hosted a secret gathering at the estate. Only 4 men attended: bankers, generals, and an occult scholar named Dr. Theodore Lang. Adrian confessed everything: the book, the pact, the disappearance, the voice. Lang listened quietly, then said something that chilled everyone present. "You didn't kill your brother, my lord. You absorbed him. When you took his life, his essence fused with yours. You share one soul trapped between 2 wills. You are not haunted. You are divided." Adrian stared at him, silent. Then he whispered, "How do I undo it?" Lang replied, "One must relinquish the throne." "What throne?" "The throne of blood. The dynasty itself." Adrian clenched his fists. "I built this with my hands." "It's mine," Lang sighed. "Then you will never be free." That night, as snow fell over the estate, Adrian stood before the grand mirror in his chamber. "If you want it," he said aloud, "come and take it." The mirror flickered. A shadow formed, his own face, smiling wickedly, and then it stepped out. No one knows what truly happened that night. The next morning, the mirror was shattered, the room empty. But within weeks, letters began arriving in Paris, signed once again by Lord Alaric Montclair, announcing his return and promising a new era for the dynasty. The world never questioned it. Newspapers printed his photographs, identical to Adrian's, but younger, sharper, colder, and those who visited him swore that sometimes, when he paused mid-conversation, his reflection would keep talking, just a second longer than he did. They said the world had changed after the war, but the Montclair bloodline hadn't. By 1912, Europe was racing toward modernity. Automobiles roared across cobblestone streets, electric lamps replaced candlelight, and new empires were built not by kings, but by tycoons. Yet deep in the heart of France, the Montclair estate stood unchanged, a monument of stone, silence, and secrets. The newspapers called him Lord Alaric Montclair, the resurrected industrialist. To the public, he was a visionary, rebuilding factories, financing railroads, and introducing a new line of motor engines that powered the continent. But to those who had known him before, there was something unsettling in his presence. His eyes had changed, darker, colder, always scanning the room as if measuring invisible ghosts. His voice, though soft, carried the echo of someone else. Some said he wasn't the same man who vanished years ago. Others whispered he wasn't a man at all. Behind closed doors, Alaric worked relentlessly. The Montclair Company expanded to London, Berlin, and Vienna. He employed engineers, chemists, and occult researchers, an odd mix that raised questions he never answered. His obsession was no longer just wealth. It was control, over time, over blood, over life itself. He spoke often of legacy, of creating something that would outlive the flesh. And then, one quiet evening, a telegram arrived from Egypt. It read, "The seal has been found. The Twin Gate is real." That night, Alaric ordered a private expedition. The world thought it was for oil, but the truth was far darker. Beneath the sands near Luxor, his men unearthed ruins of an ancient cult, a brotherhood that had once worshipped the mirror gods, deities said to dwell in duality, 2 souls bound by one fate. Among the relics was a slab of obsidian, inscribed in Latin and Egyptian. He who consumes his reflection becomes his own prison. The scholars were fascinated. Alaric, however, was terrified, for the text described exactly what had happened to him and Adrian. That same month, a woman entered his life, Evelyne Rousseau, a painter from Paris known for her haunting portraits. She'd been commissioned to paint Lord Montclair's likeness for a French exhibition. From the moment she arrived at the estate, she sensed something was wrong. The halls whispered, the mirrors flickered, and her subject, the powerful Alaric, seemed to change subtly every day. Sometimes his eyes looked weary, almost pleading. Other times they gleamed with cruel satisfaction. Evelyne became fascinated by him. During her sessions, she'd ask questions about his travels, his youth, His brother. He would smile faintly and reply, "A twin is never truly gone, mademoiselle. He merely changes the room he's standing in." But one night, when she passed the mirror-lined corridor near his study, she saw something that froze her blood. Alaric was sitting at his desk, motionless, but in the mirror, he was standing behind her. When she turned, the space was empty. She wanted to leave the next morning, but Alaric convinced her to stay, promising that her portrait would become the last true image of the Montclair legacy. Against her better judgment, she agreed. What she didn't know was that the portrait was more than art. It was a ritual. As she painted, Alaric would recite verses from the ancient book he'd unearthed years before. "Blood remembers," he'd whisper, "and the mirror listens." He began mixing a strange crimson pigment into the oils, a color he claimed no artist had ever used. When Eveline asked where it came from, he simply said, "The lineage provides." The portrait took months. When it was finally complete, she unveiled it to him and gasped. For though she had painted him exactly as he appeared, the man in the painting had two shadows. Alaric smiled. "You see it too." Days later, she vanished. Her disappearance was blamed on a train accident outside Paris. But the painting remained, locked away in Montclair's private gallery. Some said he spent hours staring at it in silence, whispering to it as though it whispered back. By 1914, war had erupted across Europe. While nations burned, Alaric Montclair profited. He supplied engines, ammunition, and steel to both sides, never choosing loyalty, only legacy. His factories became fortresses, his name both feared and revered. Yet with every victory, his mind fractured further. He would speak to empty chairs, during meetings, laugh suddenly, then fall silent for hours. One night, during an air raid, a servant entered his study and found him standing before the shattered mirror again. His reflection, or perhaps his brother, stared back. The servant claimed he heard two voices, overlapping, identical, yet distinct. "You've stolen my life." "No, brother, I am your life." Then came a sound like glass screaming. The servant fled and never returned. After the war ended, Alaric emerged wealthier than ever, but visibly altered. His hair had turned silver, though he was barely 40. He rarely appeared in public. When he did, he wore gloves to hide long scars across his hands, as if from burns. The world believed he was the only Montclair left, but rumors began to spread again, that a young man had been seen at the estate, a perfect replica of Alaric in his youth. In 1920, a British journalist named Thomas Grayson arrived to interview him for a story titled "The Man Who Owned Europe." The meeting was brief, tense, and unforgettable. Grayson later wrote in his notes, never published, that the Lord's study contained no mirrors, only black curtains. He asked Alaric one question: "What drives you now after all this success?" Alaric smiled faintly. "To end the curse of reflection." Grayson frowned. "And how will you do that?" "By replacing it," Alaric said. "By creating something that cannot mirror, only obey." That line would haunt Grayson for years. Months later, the Montclair Company revealed its next project, the Human Continuum Initiative. A network of laboratories hidden across Europe said to be researching medical advances, but in truth experimenting on blood transfusion, cellular memory, and artificial reproduction. Alaric had grown obsessed with one idea. If he could replicate life without duality, he could escape the curse forever. Witnesses recalled seeing him bring crates to the labs himself, large sealed containers marked with the Montclair crest. No one dared ask what was inside. Then, in the winter of 1923, a rumor spread that one of the experiments had succeeded. A child was born, pale, silent, and perfect. Alaric named him Lucien, after the ancestor who began the blood pact centuries ago. Lucien Montclair would become the heir to everything, the new dawn of the dynasty. But there was something strange about him. He never cried as an infant. He never spoke as a child. And his reflection, according to the nurses, never matched his movements exactly. Alaric adored him, yet feared him. He claimed the boy had his brother's eyes. The servants avoided the nursery, saying they could hear whispers when they passed by. Years went by. By 1928, Lucian had grown into a quiet, beautiful young man with the same black hair and piercing eyes that defined the Montclairs for generations. He was brilliant in every subject, yet emotionally distant, as if hollow. When Alaric looked at him, he felt both pride and dread, for in that boy, he saw both his future and his reflection. One night Lucian asked him, "Father, who am I?" Alaric hesitated. "You are a Montclair." Lucien tilted his head. "No. Who am I?" And in that instant, Alaric realized the curse had begun again. The dynasty had survived, but the bloodline was no longer human. The bells of Elderscourt tolled that morning, not in celebration, but in warning. The sound rolled across the valleys and over the old castle walls like a haunting reminder that peace in this land was always temporary. Inside the great marble halls of the palace, twin portraits stood side by side, one of Lysander, wearing the crown, the other of Cassian, in his general's armor. Their eyes, identical, unblinking, seemed to follow every servant who passed. People whispered that the souls of both men had begun to drift apart, that one twin had been born to rule the world, and the other to destroy it. Years had passed since Lysander and Cassian claimed the throne together. The empire had grown vast. Trade routes flourished, armies expanded, and the twin kings were hailed as the saviors of the continent. Yet beneath the golden glory rot was spreading. A famine had struck the southern provinces. The commoners, once loyal, now murmured rebellion. And every rumor, every spark of unrest, pointed toward one unsettling truth. The balance between the twins was breaking. Lysander had changed. Power had made him cautious, cold even. He had begun relying on priests, astrologers, and omens, searching for signs of betrayal within his own bloodline. The same man who once led armies on horseback now sat behind locked doors, drowning himself in scrolls of prophecy. And every prophecy said the same thing. The dynasty built by twins shall be destroyed by twins. Cassian, meanwhile, had become the empire's blade. While Lysander ruled from the throne, Cassian ruled from the shadows, the general, the enforcer, the man who silenced rebellions before they could begin. Yet in the quiet of night, guilt haunted him. Every man he'd executed in the name of peace stared back at him in his dreams. And in those dreams he always heard the same whisper, his mother's voice. "Do not build a kingdom on blood." The first true fracture came during the Great Feast of Unity, the annual celebration that marked the founding of their reign. Nobles from across the empire gathered in the grand hall, their laughter echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings. But Lysander had arrived late, his eyes dark, his voice trembling with restrained fury. He raised his cup toward his brother and said, "To the general who fights in my name, and forgets who wears the crown." The laughter died. Cassian froze. The silence that followed was heavier than any weapon. It was a public humiliation, a declaration that Lysander no longer trusted his twin. And when Cassian's cup touched the table again, the alliance that had built an empire began to crumble. That night, Cassian walked alone through the castle corridors. The moonlight spilled across the floor, illuminating the carvings on the walls, the story of two brothers, bound by fate. He paused at one scene. Two young boys standing before a dying king, promising to rule as one. He traced his fingers across the stone, whispering to himself, "We kept that promise," until power turned it to poison. In the weeks that followed, secret messages began to move through the palace, unsigned letters, veiled threats, and warnings of assassination plots. Some were real, some were illusions crafted by Lysander's paranoid council. But the effect was the same. The twins were being pulled apart by fear. One stormy night, Lysander summoned Cassian to the throne room. The rain crashed against the stained glass windows, and thunder rolled like the voice of God. "You've been meeting with the southern lords," Lysander said quietly. Cassian clenched his fists. "To stop the rebellion before it reaches your gates." "My gates?" Lysander's voice sharpened. "You speak as if the empire belongs to you." Cassian's eyes flashed. I fought for this empire when you were hiding behind marble walls, and I built it from the ashes you left behind." The argument erupted like lightning, two identical faces twisted by fury, shouting the same words they once used to swear loyalty. Servants fled from the room as the storm outside intensified. Finally, Lysander's voice broke through the chaos. "You are not my brother anymore. You are my shadow, and I will not let the shadow consume the light." Cassian stared at him for a long moment. The rain washed across the windows like tears. "Then you've already lost the light, brother." He turned and walked out, and for the first time, the throne room felt colder than the grave. Days later, the Empire learned of Cassian's exile. The official decree claimed treasonous correspondence with rebellious lords, but among the people, no one believed it. The twins had been inseparable since birth. The idea that one would betray the other felt like blasphemy. And yet, the truth was even darker. Lysander had begun believing in an ancient curse, that the bloodline of twins was unnatural, forbidden by the old gods. He had convinced himself that to save the Empire, he must destroy his brother. Cassian rode into exile with a handful of loyal soldiers. They wandered the borders of the Empire, hunted by their own kin, living on whispers and memory. But the exiled twin was not broken. In the shadows, Cassian began to gather strength. Warriors who'd lost faith in the crown, lords who'd been stripped of titles. They all found a new banner to fight under. The banner of the forgotten king. Months turned into years. The empire Lysander ruled from his throne was still vast, but it was bleeding from within. The famine spread, the treasury emptied, and the people began chanting a dangerous name: Cassian. Lysander could not sleep. Every night he saw his brother in his dreams, standing in the ruins of their childhood home, holding a crown of fire. And each time, the dream ended with the same words: "Two cannot wear one crown." One winter dawn, a messenger arrived at the gates of Elder's Court. His face was pale, his cloak torn by the cold. In his trembling hands he carried a sealed letter. Lysander broke the wax and read the first line. "Brother, the dynasty we built together was never meant to last." Cassian's armies were returning. The exiled twin was coming home. The drums of war echoed once more through the empire, the same rhythm that had united them in their youth, now beating to tear them apart. As Lysander stood on the palace balcony, watching the smoke rise in the distance, he whispered to himself, "So this is what it means to be chosen by destiny, to destroy the only part of yourself that still remembers love." The snow fell softly on his crown as the empire prepared for the final reckoning. The twins had created a dynasty. Now one of them would have to end it. The wind that morning carried the smell of iron, sharp, cold, and unforgiving. It swept through the valleys of Elder's Court and rattled the flags atop every fortress. The drums that once announced victory now heralded something darker, a civil war between blood. Lysander stood upon the battlements, watching as his army assembled below. The banners of the royal guard fluttered, their crimson colors faded by years of sunlight and blood. He could hear the soldiers murmuring among themselves, their voices trembling with disbelief. They were preparing to fight the same general who had once led them to glory, their king's own twin, Cassian. "Your Majesty," said Commander Vale, kneeling beside him. "The scouts have confirmed it. Cassian's forces have crossed the river Darnell. He has allies in the southern and eastern provinces." "He's coming!" Lysander's face did not move. His eyes, however, flickered, for just a moment, with something human. "Regret. I once dreamed we would die side by side," he murmured. "Now fate demands I bury my brother myself." The commander hesitated. "Shall I prepare the catapults, sire?" Lysander's answer came like a whisper of steel. "No, prepare the throne room. When he arrives, I will greet him as a king or a ghost." Far from the palace, Cassian rode through the fog-covered plains with his army at his back. The men followed him not out of duty, but devotion. They called him the Forgotten King, the one who would restore the empire's honor. His armor bore no crown, only a black emblem of two intertwined serpents devouring each other. Cassian's eyes, once bright with loyalty, were now heavy with purpose. He did not crave revenge. He sought correction. In his mind, Lysander had betrayed their vow. the promise that their rule would be one of balance, not tyranny. As they camped beside the river that night, Cassian sat alone by the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, flickering like memories. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small golden locket, their mother's keepsake. Inside, a faded sketch of two boys holding hands, their faces smeared with dirt, but smiling like the world was theirs. "Do you still see that boy when you look at me, Lysander?" he whispered into the wind. "Or have the gods turned us into monsters?" A raven landed near him, its feathers soaked with rain. Around its leg was tied a strip of red cloth, the royal sigil. Cassian untied it and read the message scrawled in his brother's unmistakable hand. "Come home. Let us finish what began with our birth." The war began 3 days later. The plains outside Elderskort were swallowed by fog as two armies faced each other beneath the gray morning sky. Trumpets sounded, not in triumph but in mourning. Men who once trained together now raised their swords against each other, shouting names of loyalty neither side could claim anymore. Lysander stood on the front lines, his crown replaced by a black iron helm. His voice cut through the storm like thunder. "Hold the line, for the blood of kings." Cassian answered from across the field, his own voice carrying through the wind. "For the blood that kings have spilled." And then chaos. The clash of metal roared across the valley. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of brotherly hate. Arrows screamed through the air. Horses fell, shields shattered. The fog turned red. Cassian fought like a spirit unleashed. Every strike was a memory, every parry a scar. He remembered their childhood sparring sessions in the courtyard, how Lysander would always hold back his blows. Now there was no restraint. Somewhere in the madness their eyes met. Across the field of fire and blood, two identical men locked gazes. The same eyes, the same blood, the same curse. And in that frozen moment, the world seemed to stop. They charged. Their swords collided with a sound that echoed across the plains like the crack of fate itself. The impact sent sparks flying into the mist. Around them, men ceased fighting, watching in awe as the two kings battled like gods cast down to earth. "Why, brother?" Lysander shouted, blocking a strike. "You were meant to stand beside me." "I did," Cassian roared, his voice breaking with fury and grief. "Until you forgot who you were standing for." Their blades danced, elegant, furious, tragic. Lysander's strikes were calculated, precise, the mind of a ruler. Cassian's were raw, emotional, the heart of a soldier. Every clash was both a duel and a conversation. Every wound a confession. Minutes became hours. The storm above broke, rain crashing down over the field, washing blood into the mud. At last, both men fell to their knees, swords clashing one final time before they locked together, panting, trembling. Cassian pressed his forehead against Lysander's. "We were never meant to rule this world. We were meant to destroy it." Lysander's eyes widened, not in fear but understanding. "Perhaps that's why the gods made us twins. To balance the curse with love." Then, a flash of movement. A soldier, desperate to protect his king, thrust his spear. Cassian turned, too late. The blade pierced his side. Lysander's scream tore through the battlefield. He caught his brother as he fell, cradling him like a child. "No, not like this." Cassian coughed, blood mixing with rain. "The dynasty is yours now, brother. Make it worth the blood it took." And with a faint smile he whispered, "We built it together. Don't let it die alone." His hand slipped from Lysander's grasp. The rain fell harder. The battlefield went silent. Lysander rose, his brother's body in his arms, and turned to his soldiers. His voice, broken yet terrifying, echoed through the storm. "There are no victors in this war. Only ghosts." He ordered the fighting to stop. Every sword dropped to the ground. The rain washed away the blood, but not the sin. That night, the king of Elderskort lit a single pyre at the heart of the battlefield. Upon it he laid Cassian, his brother, his enemy, his mirror. The flames rose into the night, painting the sky with grief. As the fire burned, Lysander removed his crown and threw it into the pyre. The metal melted, merging with the embers until it was nothing but ash. He whispered, "A dynasty built on blood must end in fire." And as the first light of dawn touched the land, the empire that the twins built was silent, not destroyed, but hollow, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Lysander vanished soon after. Some said he wandered the ruins, haunted by his brother's voice. Others claimed he became a monk in the northern mountains, praying for forgiveness until his final breath. But those who visited the old battlefield swore that on cold, misty mornings, they could still see two figures standing side by side, identical, silhouettes watching over the land they once ruled. Brothers, kings, shadows of destiny. The dynasty had been created and buried by the same blood that gave it life. The years that followed the War of Mirrors were years of silence. The empire, once roaring with parades and trumpets, had turned into a whisper that carried only through ruins, empty halls, and deserted villages. The golden banners that once bore the mark of the twin serpents now hung in tatters, fluttering like ghosts in the wind. The fire that ended the battle had not just burned bodies, it had burned history. The empire had become a tomb, and the throne of Elderscourt sat empty, dust gathering on its cold marble seat. But somewhere beyond the mountains, deep in the snow-covered monastery of Hearthvale, an old man prayed before dawn each day. His hair had turned silver, his hands trembled with age, yet his voice, when it spoke the ancient hymns, still carried the weight of command. That man was Lysander. He had fled the world after the pyre burned his brother's body. Some said he was driven mad. Others whispered he was cursed to live with the memory of what he had done. He had no crown, no title, no empire, only his guilt. The monks never asked for his name. They knew the look in his eyes, the look of a man who had once ruled and lost everything. He spent his years in silence, copying ancient scrolls and tending to the monastery's gardens. But each night, when the candles dimmed, he would walk to the edge of the cliffs and stare into the storm clouds that gathered above the valley. He would whisper, "Do you see it, Cassian? The world we built, the world we burned." And sometimes, when the wind howled through the peaks, he swore he heard a voice answer, soft, familiar, eternal. "We never built it for them, brother. We built it for each other." One evening, as the first snow began to fall, a young monk entered Lysander's cell carrying a scroll sealed in red wax, the seal of the royal archive, untouched for decades. "My lord," the monk said softly, "this was found beneath the ruins of Elderscourt. It bears your family's crest." Lysander's fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a map, a rough sketch of the empire's borders. But there, in the southern lands once loyal to Cassian, a new symbol had been drawn. Two serpents entwined, not devouring each other this time, but facing outward, guarding something. Below it, written in Cassian's own hand, were 4 words. "The dynasty still lives." Lysander's heart stopped. Could it be true? Had Cassian's bloodline survived? He had no children of his own, at least none that history remembered. But Cassian, he had taken a lover during his exile, a noblewoman from the southern coast. There had been rumors of a child, but Lysander had dismissed them as fantasy. Now, staring at the map, he realized the truth. His brother's lineage had not died in the fire. It had endured, hidden, silent, patient. A single tear rolled down Lysander's cheek. "Then the curse remains," he whispered. The old prophecy had said it plainly. The dynasty born of twins shall rise thrice, once in glory, once in blood, and once in shadow. The first rise had been their reign, the second, their war. And now, somewhere out there in the shadows of a broken empire, the third had begun. Weeks passed before Lysander decided to leave the monastery. The monks begged him to stay. His body was frail, his breath shallow. But he knew his time had come. The world was calling again, and he had one final duty to fulfill. He descended the mountains alone, wrapped in a cloak of gray wool, the snow crunching beneath his steps. For days he traveled through villages that no longer bore names, through forests where no birds sang, until he reached the ruins of Elderscourt. The palace was a skeleton now, pillars cracked, ceilings open to the sky. Ivy climbed across the walls where tapestries once hung. In the center of the throne room stood the blackened pyre where Cassian's body had burned. Lysander fell to his knees before it. "Brother," he whispered, "if your blood yet walks this earth, let it rule wisely. Let it not carry our sins." Then, from the shadows, came a sound, the quiet crunch of footsteps. Lysander turned. A figure emerged, tall, cloaked, the hood drawn low. But as the stranger stepped into the light that streamed through the broken ceiling, Lysander froze. The face beneath that hood was his own, or rather, a younger version of it. The man's eyes were the same gray as the winter sky, his expression calm but unreadable. Around his neck hung a pendant, 2 intertwined serpents. "I am not your ghost," the stranger said quietly. "I am his." Lysander's voice trembled. "Cassian's blood." The young man nodded. "And yours." The realization hit like thunder. The dynasty had indeed survived, not as one brother's legacy, but as both. The bloodline of twins had merged again, generations later, into a single heir bearing both halves of the curse. "Why have you come?" Lysander asked, though part of him already knew. "To learn the truth," the young man said, "and to end what you began." They walked together through the ruins, old king and young heir, as Lysander recounted the rise and fall of the dynasty. He spoke of their childhood, their war, the fire, the betrayal, everything. The young man listened in silence, his jaw tightening as the weight of history settled on his shoulders. When the story ended, Lysander turned to him. "The world does not need kings anymore. It needs memory. Learn from our sins. Do not repeat them." The heir nodded slowly. "Then the dynasty will live, not as a throne, but as a story." Lysander smiled faintly. "That is all it was ever meant to be." He placed the locket, their mother's locket, into the young man's hands. "Keep it close, and when you hear the wind whisper, listen. It will be us." As dawn broke over the ruins, Lysander's strength began to fade. He sat upon the old steps of the throne, his breath steady but shallow. "You remind me of him," he murmured. "Of Cassian?" the heir asked. "No," Lysander said softly. "Of us." His eyes lifted to the morning sun, and for the first time in decades, peace returned to his face. When the light touched his crownless head, the last king of the dynasty closed his eyes and never opened them again. Iwi, the young heir, buried him beside the pyre where the brothers had once stood together. No grand monument, no army, no priest, just stone and silence. Then, before leaving the ruins, he carved words into the marble with his blade, words that would outlast every empire, every crown, every bloodline. From one soul split in two, the world was born and broken. Let the fire remember, and let the blood finally rest. Centuries later, travelers passing through the valley would speak of an old legend, of twin kings whose shadows still walked the battlefield on misty mornings, guarding a forgotten land. And in that silence, if you listened closely, the wind would carry a voice, neither curse nor warning, but love. "Brother, we built a dynasty. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out."